Hello, my name is Judy Kalman, and thank you for joining me and my co-author, María del Carmen Lorenzatti, in our presentation, our video presentation of Innovating Pedagogy and Practice in Adult Education Responding to COVID-19. I'm a researcher in the Center for Research and Advanced Studies in Mexico, and Marieta is a researcher at two universities in Argentina, the National University at Córdoba and the National University in Chilecito. Before I begin, I would like to make a comment about the way I'm going to present this pre-recorded presentation. I'm going to go through each slide and give the main ideas, and I'm going to leave an extra few seconds so that you can read the text if you care to. You can always stop it to continue to read before we go on. So, the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic on the world stage has impacted our lives in a number of different ways, and it's affected how we interact, how we organize our public affairs, even our leisure activities, and the way we carry out daily life. And the continued spread of the virus and public health measures to mitigate it have led to school closures worldwide. In youth and adult education programs aimed at people with little or no schooling, many governments and local organizations have chosen to close their doors. There have been some attempts to create ad hoc online or technologically mediated options, but for those who did not do that previous to the pandemic, it was much more difficult to achieve that option than those who already did. So the pandemic has exposed really the current state of affairs of the use of digital technologies and other technologies, but in particular digital technologies for education. And even though there have been great efforts made in the past to provide digital options and for schooling, for the most part, it's been dedicated to buying and distributing equipment and creating infrastructure, and much less attention has been paid to teacher training. There are significant inequalities in both the social and the material conditions for digital infrastructure and using digital technologies in schools and I would say also outside of schools. And here's a very simple example. Think about a cell phone. Cell phones, there may be many cell phones among the population, but not all cell phones are the same. Not all have access to online data. Not all have the capacity to store or run apps. And some cell phones may not even have a good power source or a complete screen. So what we want to talk about today more specifically is a program that is being run in Villa María in the center of Argentina. And it's a program that's been running now for about 4 years. And at the time the pandemic broke out, like many other programs, this one was facing school closure. And so a series of priorities were made to be able to try and come up with a way for students to continue with their educational activities. So for most literacy and adult education instructors are not trained to work remotely or have or at a distance, and students expect to attend classes. And we researched students and teachers' existing infrastructure and created options to work online. We were trying to figure out what did they have and what was at their within reach for them to continue to that we could use so that they could continue with their programs. And this implied, among other things, a significant reduction in the curriculum and a redesign of activities that could be viable under these conditions. This program is, as I had said earlier, is being run in Villa María. I have a picture here so you can get an idea what this small city looks like. And it has several interesting features to it. Before the pandemic, it had literacy, primary, and secondary options for students who had different educational needs and development. And it had a very important administrative structure to it that that made students getting in and staying in the program feasible. So one of them is that it's set up in neighborhoods and in neighborhood community centers and churches to make it readily available. And the other was that it was extremely flexible in terms of what students could do and the timelines for doing it. And also an important feature is that it was funded by the municipal government. So two other important aspects about this program that I want to mention specifically are, one, that a series of policies were put into place that would help students be able to attend on a regular basis. One of them that stands out is that the program provides childcare for these adult students so that when they're in school, their children are taken care of. And the other aspect that I think is worth mentioning is that the curriculum is built around local problems and issues, and academic content and academic practices are articulated to these issues and problems, so that what the students have to think about and talk about is familiar and readily useful in their daily personal and community lives. So when the shelter-in-place policies were announced, schools began to close, and it was necessary to think about how we could try and keep the program going even on a more reduced level. And one of the things that did happen is that the financing for this program was reallocated to local health services, and so the number of tutors available was reduced drastically, and only 7 educators were left to attend to 475 students. So given the situation and the precariousness of the communities, what we decided first was that we would have to postpone the literacy and primary groups because they had more dependence on face-to-face or in-person teaching. And one of the reasons is because these are students who do not have a strong history with school and experience with school. So for them to be more autonomous and self-directing was much more difficult. In this new stage of our work, we decided that we would have to come up with ways to maintain continuous communication with the students and figure out ways to favor appropriation of knowledge from a distance. So once the suspension of the face-to-face activities was declared, several operational decisions were made. And with the secondary level classes, we decided to incorporate the use of Google Docs, and on Drive, and we also began to use the Google forms that allowed us to send out in a questionnaire type format assignments where the students could answer directly into that format, and it also gave us a spreadsheet that showed all of their answers. And so when we were able to track more easily the 400 students who were participating in this. And so assignments were sent out by Google on Google Forms, and they returned their homework, and we used WhatsApp. We're still using WhatsApp as a way to interact with the students, and this had the advantage that before we went into the sheltered home mode, we also had the students already had working WhatsApp groups, and this facilitated and gave continuity to one of the ways that they interacted. What I'm going to do now is share with you one of the academic units that we developed specifically in this new mode, and a language and literature unit, and the students were asked to read and respond to a story called Los Caminos de Roma, written by the Mexican writer Benjamin de Buen, and it was published in a Mexico City cultural supplement in 2017. And if you're interested in the story, I have included also the link to it. So the way we was based on ways of thinking about text. So we used Heath and Mangiola's 1991 suggestions and about different ways of interacting and thinking about text. So they suggest that it's important to say what the text means, interpret it in some way, link the text with personal experience, connect what you're reading to other kinds of texts, and to explain and argue from the text. And this is not all of their suggestions, but they are the main ones. So another aspect that we kept in mind when we were developing this unit was Langer's idea about literary thought, and she says that being literate means acting and thinking like a literate person and mobilizing the resources and ways of reasoning and reflecting that we use when we're reading and writing, even when we are not necessarily reading and writing. And there's a clear emphasis on actions and forms of thought that constitute reading and writing, and not on the processes of decoding and encoding. So from our own point of view, we work with a notion of literacy that has to do with that goes far beyond learning written code, and we believe that literacy has to do with reading and writing in the social world and participating in valued culture events and establishing and maintaining social relationships. And we conceive literacy as a social practice and that emphasizes the performative, the use of text, and how they're and the different levels or textures that make them up. So our ideas have to do with reading and writing as they occur in broader social and cultural practices, and how the activities and actions of reading and writing are entangled with the actions and activities of these other practices. Over 400 students participated in this unit, though not all at the same time because of the flexibility of the program. We got a bulk of responses to the unit, and then another important number, I would say maybe 25%, came trickling in. And what we asked them to do was to try to stage, get a feel for where the story takes place. It takes place in the city of Rome. And then we asked them to read and reread the story from different angles. And then at the very end, we asked them to try and think about the story from a more literary and formal perspective in terms of story as genre. And I want to point out that our way of proceeding is not typical for in many language and literature classes, at least in Mexico or Argentina, where the tendency is to start with the literary genre and its structure, and we instead start with images of the city, and we prompt the students to anticipate the development of a central argument, and um, then we ask them to read and reread from a variety of angles, and only at the end did we ask them to think about the story think about this in terms of genre. So I'm going to specifically talk about two questions, the prompts that we gave the students that implied selecting, analyzing, presenting evidence, and using examples. Even with these explicit suggestions and questions, it's interesting to see how the answers that we received were varied. There's quite a bit of difference between one and the other. And here are two to the right of the screen. You can see the questions that were one of the questions or set of questions that we put forward, and below I have transcribed two of the answers, and I'll give you a moment to read those. And of course, these are translations from Spanish. So the first response, you can see how the reader identifies with the character and recognizes his joy and implements a persuasive mechanism to woo the ice cream parlor employee. And this student perceives that his thoughts are positive about the protagonist's action, despite having experienced a similar disappointment in love himself as a young man. And the second answer corresponds to someone who did not experience something similar as the protagonist, but at the same time has an appreciation of the circumstances that, although adverse, produce lessons in life. We found that there were several combinations of textual genres within their answers, a phenomena that has been amply studied by Blomart. And in particular, we were interested in the way they used lists to present their answers, and in a very varied way. For example, in some cases they just named a few elements, and in some cases they expanded on what they wrote. We find that to move forward, we must enrich the way we interact with students around their work. We have not found a way yet, but we're working on it, to turn their production into an object of reflection, and especially because there's so many students involved at the same time. This is due to the number of students that must be attended and the reduced number of tutors to do so. Also, there's been a severe reduction of hours. Reviewing students' work and requesting revisions is essential to promote the appropriation of written language, and even in face-to-face educational situations, this is not done extensively. Here, the interaction between instructors and learners is basically reduced to requesting assignments, circulating materials, and receiving them. If we continue in this modality for longer, finding a way to work on their writing and understanding text in more robust ways will be necessary. And this is a pending issue for youth and adult education, as well as education in general. So to summarize, here are some conclusions. For the most part, our use of the digital environment has been a platform for exchanging prompts and assignments. There is an urgent need for educators to reinvent the work of schooling to deepen students' construction of academic practices, appropriate current problems, and manage multiple cultural resources. The digital must be transformed into a learning environment, a space where using these technologies is part of the knowledge to be built, and we need to design activities for it. This is true now in the pandemic, but also more broadly in education in general. This imperative is not just for adult and youth education, but also for basic and advanced teaching and learning. Before we finish or we finalize, here is a list of our references. Thank you for joining us today.